So I just want to sort of start by prefacing that, what I have today is sort of more, hypothesis and a set of questions which I think could be, very fruitful for us to explore and sort of possibly preliminary answers, but not complete answers at this point. So, I hope that sort of our discussions today, help towards building that. It's still preliminary at this point. And so I study the theory and history of European social democracy. And, a part of what I'm interested with this project is to sort of, see how Marxist-Feminist analysis of social reproduction can enrich and further develop an explanation of how social democracy developed in Europe. And I'm focusing on the sort of the moments in the 1970s when the Fordist model, the Fordist model of accumulation was in crisis, and in one of the periods in which the sort of the left prospects for socialist development, was much greater, right? So there was one moment in history when socialism potentially had a chance, considering the very high levels of left and labor mobilizations. And of course, what happened was that the left failed, in the advanced capitalist world, pretty much everywhere, from the US to UK, but also, in France, Italy, and of course in Sweden as well. And the universal failure of the left, at least in the advanced capitalist world in the 1970s, is sort of what led to the rise of neoliberalism, right? So that's the starting point, and what I'm interested in exploring is why the left, the socialist forces, the working class, lost the big struggles in the 70s, even though they were so well organized at that time. Okay. And so my central sort of hypothesis or question is, did the organization of social reproduction and the Fordism, did it contribute to the defeat of the left? So did it sort of shape the struggles of the 70s? In particular, did it shape the character of the working class organization, left organizations in the 70s, in a sense that it actually damaged and undermined the prospect of the left victory then? Sort of that's the starting question. And all right. And hopefully sort of that contributes to a greater discussion about the relationship between capitalism and patriarchy by looking at the sort of particular historical moment, particular historical configuration of capitalism, and how patriarchy may have reinforced it, right? And okay, let's see. So I'll just speak briefly about the different sort of configurations of a socialist project that was attempted in the 1970s. And I see there were sort of two major paths, or two major models proposed by the left in the 1970s. And one is sort of possibly sort of more well known. This is probably the model which most of us would sort of think of first. Let's say, which was attempted by the Mitterrand government in France, and also by the left wing of the Labour Party in the UK. And possibly many other European countries as well, I believe, is that it's basically the combination of nationalization and then extensive demand stimulation through the expansion of the welfare state. Basically, so it's ramped up Keynesianism combined with extensive nationalization. And so I think that was, often the sort of the, default go-to model for the left. I mean, which makes sense. That of course, if you want socialism, what do? Well, you nationalize the whole thing. But of course, that model didn't exactly work out, and there are many, causes to that we can discuss more. But one is, of course, that there was a, limit to how much Keynesian stimulation could proceed further, considering the stagflationary conditions in the 70s. And of course, in the French case, when it was actually seriously attempted, it was the balance of payments crisis and the currency agreement with Germany and stuff like that. That was the immediate cause. But the underlying sort of issue is the structural limit to such Keynesian stimulations. And as for nationalizations, of course, it would immediately face the capital strike and capital flight and things like that, right? But then there was actually sort of an alternative model of socialization, which was sort of attempted which went the farthest in Sweden, even though sort of, similar but much milder model of it was sort of attempted in Germany and the other corporatist countries. And so this is the wage earner funds model. And so how it works is basically that either by legislation or collective agreement, it's stipulated that the companies would have to transfer a certain portion of profits, let's say 20% of profits every year, in the forms of the shares to the unions represented in the company. And so how it works in the year one, 20% of the profits would, in the forms of shares, would be transferred to the unions. So unions would gain, let's say, like 1% or 2% of the company. I mean, it depends on how big the profit is. But then if you repeat that every year, year after year, then of course the share of ownership of the unions in the company would grow every year, right? So you hit 10%, 20%, so on and so on. And then if the companies continued making healthy profits, then in 30 to 35 years, it was estimated that the unions would come to own the 51% of the company's shares, and that's the magic point, which hits socialism, right? And at that point, the majority of capital would come to be owned by the working class organizations, and that's sort of how you get to socialism, right? So this was proposed by the committee headed by Rudolf Meidner, a Marxist economist in Sweden, and sort of very notably, it was actually came from the very top of the union organization. So it wasn't just the sort of, the grassroots, fringe left radicals. It actually came from the very top of the very centralized and powerful union organization. I mean, at that point, more than 80% of the workers were in the unions in Sweden, and this LO, this blue-collar confederation, the main union in Sweden, actually represented like the majority of all workers, and the leadership of that actually endorsed this plan, so it was a pretty big deal. And if you have sort of more questions, thoughts about how it exactly came about, I can sort of discuss more later. But anyways, so my point is that sort of this scheme had a real prospect, considering the sort of the level of support it got in the Swedish labor movement. And sort of in connecting this with the theories of socialist transition, so Eric Olin Wright, a US Marxist sociologist, has been developing theories of real utopias and different forms of socialist transition in recent years, and this is the ideotypical example of what he calls the symbiotic or social democratic model of transition, right? So step by step, so each step is sort of not particularly revolutionary, in that it may, sort of satisfy some of the capitalist interests, and sort of, it's not exactly revolutionary, but the culmination of that sort of becomes the qualitative transformation, right? So this is the ideotypical model of a social democratic transition to socialism. But of course, as I hinted earlier, as I noted earlier, this failed, as in how it failed exactly is that the Social Democratic Party, of course, diluted it over time because of the intense capitalist opposition, of which is to be expected, and the comparatively weak worker mobilization for it basically shifted it to the right, and it was diluted to the point of meaninglessness, being that it would never reach socialism, and it was sort of instituted in '83, but it didn't exactly go anywhere. So the outcome was defeat, and the significance of that is because it was defeated instead of, investment coming from the workers. Basically, you have to depend on private investment and private profits in order to keep the economy going. And so that led to the social democratic form of neoliberalism in Sweden, which of course was much milder than the US and the UK, but nonetheless sort of neoliberal shift in Sweden was also very clear in the 80s, and it was all sort of initiated by the Social Democrats, which I argue was directly connected to the failure of the wage earner fund model of capital accumulation. Now, so where the sort of social reproduction fits in is I just want to sort of foreground this hypothesis briefly by briefly stating the understanding of social reproduction under Fordism. So I think that, there's, of course, this was a subject of very active debate in the 70s, the domestic labor debate, and so forth. But I think the key point for our purposes today is that, domestic labor was, on the one hand, sort of fundamentally integrated into capitalism in the sense that the reproduction of the entire household was basically depended on the wage labor, well, in the typical case of the husband, and of course for the unpaid domestic reproductive workers, their reproduction was further mediated by patriarchal marriage contract and dependence on that. But so it was not exactly independent from capitalism in the sense that households did not have their own means of production, right? But on the other hand, the character of labor organization of reproductive labor was of course fundamentally distinct from a more typical capitalist sector in that it was very isolated, and basically the socialization, socialization in the sense of how in capitalism all these forces of production would come to be integrated together under capital, right? So that's in capitalist sector, socialization would occur under capitalism, but in the reproductive sector under Fordism, of course, it didn't occur, right? And so I think that the hypothesis here is that, let's see, this sort of the disjuncture in the level of socialization between the productive, so the properly capitalist sector of the Fordist economy and the domestic reproductive sector created disjunctures in how different fragments of the working class, the workers, responded and created political demands in the 70s, which prevented a sort of hegemonic project around which the whole working class could unite. And I'll sort of illustrate, how am I doing on time? Good. Okay, so I'll just illustrate that with the concrete examples from the Swedish example. So the wage earner funds was based on, basically it's about expropriating, gradually expropriating the existing corporations, right? So it was premised upon the capitalist process of socialization already occurring. So it mostly did not apply to the reproductive sector, right? It mostly applied to the properly capitalist sector, which was still male dominant. So what it meant was when this proposal of wage earner fund was drafted in the first place, even though it actually had a quite explicit commitment to socialism and sort of using the profits deriving from that for, like worker education and culture and strengthening unions and things like that. So there's quite an extensive conception of socialism, but there was not much, if any, about restructuring the reproductive sector of the economy. And which, of course, we could, attribute to that to the sexism of the male leadership of the unions, and it was, of course, definitely, that played a role. But I think the another sort of deeper reason rooted in the structure of the economy was that the reproductive sectors were just not represented in these unions that drafted this proposal, and which meant that the proposal could not encompass the transformation of the reproductive sector. And on the other hand, so what the reproductive workers were advocating then was, of course, to socialize reproduction in the first place, right? And which was to say, to construct more daycare centers and things like that, sort of out of the private households into the socialized sphere. And this involves socialization in double sense, that it just to, integrate these means of production collectively, and then to take it out of the capitalist sectors. So while the properly capitalist sector had already been, socialized in a capitalist sense, for the reproductive sector, the socialization had to be fought in the first place in the 70s. So that led to a very distinct demand coming from the organizations like the Social Democratic Women's Movement, which was sort of part of the party but very powerful, and they had this document like the Socialist Family Policy in 1972, which was sort of very explicit that what their demands could not be satisfied under capitalism. So they were very explicit that the socialism was a necessary precondition for the socialization of reproduction that they were demanding. But sort of the ways in which that was demanded, precisely because the wage earner funds did not take into reproductive labor at all, were sort of divorced from the struggles around the wage earner funds. And I looked through on the archives of the Social Democratic Women's Federation and sort of more radical Marxist-Feminist groups in the 70s in Sweden. And of course, there were there was lots of talk about socialism, but really no discussions or mobilizations at all on the wage earner funds in particular, right? And so I think there was the structure in which reproductive labor was structured under Fordism led to the disjunctive struggles between the productive workers and reproductive workers in the 70s, which led to sort of the failure of a hegemonic project to emerge. And okay, so now, I mean, of course, there were many other reasons that why the wage earner funds failed, and this disjuncture is only one of the reasons. But I think that sort of if we imagine a possible counterfactual in which the reproductive labor had already been socialized, then it would not be difficult to imagine that a proposal like the wage earner funds would have involved sort of more innovative ideas in which how these funds could be used to actually socialize the reproductive sector as well, and of course eventually to sort of the whole economy would be centered on care revolution and these ideas, right? That's what we were discussing earlier. The whole economy would come to sort of shift towards emphasizing more high quality and non-alienated reproductive labor, and these ideas could have and would have emerged if reproductive labor had been socialized as well, but since it was not the case, the disjuncture was very hard to bridge. Okay, and finally, it's just the sort of a few remarks on the specificity of the Swedish case, and I sort of consider this as a critical case in the sense that even then Sweden had the socialization of reproductive labor had gone slightly a bit further in Sweden than most other advanced capitalist countries. By 1970, already the proportion of paid reproductive workers, so that's mostly the public sector, but was slightly greater than the unpaid domestic sector, and by 1980, sort of the margin was considerably bigger. And I don't have the concrete comparative data from other European countries, but I believe that sort of the way the proportion of unpaid domestic reproductive labor was much bigger in other European countries. So I guess what I'm sort of trying to demonstrate with the Swedish case is that even in the case where the socialization of reproductive labor had gone farthest, then of course it was far from sufficient for that to lead to the hegemonic project. So if it didn't work in Sweden, of course, it had even less of a chance in other advanced capitalist countries. So that's why I think that the Swedish case can at least shed some light onto some sort of theoretical, more universal theoretical implications because it is a critical case. So I'll end there, and I'm looking forward to more discussions and comments. Thank you.